Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the IEU's Virtual Talk on Wildmeat, Health, Climate and Environment, Why Balance Matters. Before I hand this over to our very august speaker today, Dr. Robert Nasi, I did want to introduce the IEU and its virtual talks. And just by way of introduction, I'm Dr. Jo Puri. I head the Independent Evaluation Unit, and it's really a huge privilege for me to be here today. The IEU's virtual talks, as the world is facing the reality of COVID, we have adjusted our lunch talks that we used to hold monthly to adjust to this new reality. So we used to have our in-person lunch talks in G Tower in Songdo, South Korea. But now we have these virtual talks, which are essentially we're making lemonade out of lemons, because it also helps us to reach out to a far greater audience and allows us to change some of our timing so that we can bring in a lot of our colleagues and friends from across the world. The IEU's virtual talks, just like its lunch talks, feature leaders in the international space and are a venue for dialogue and exchange on topics that are important to all of us, but especially in the areas of public goods, because we think that these are areas that are ill-visited by most people and organizations. We also use the IEU's virtual talks to increase understanding about the independent evaluation unit of the GCF, or the Green Climate Fund, and its overall mandate. While also increasing awareness of diverse voices and streams of learning, both in the areas of evaluation, but also in the areas of climate change and development. Ladies and gentlemen, this talk is recorded and will also be put on the IEU's YouTube channel. While the talk is going on and after the talk, we also encourage you to tweet messages from this talk using the IEU's handle at GCF_eval. Our event hashtag is hashtag IEU Talks with an S at the end. You can also scan our QR code that it should be on your screens to access all of the IEU social media and online channels. These talks are open to everyone. We encourage you to share information about these talks with people outside of GCF and in your professional circles. So how will this talk run? This is a 1-hour session that will run from now till 5 p.m. Korea's local time. Robert will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we want to have as much Q&A and as interactive a discussion as possible. So we are scheduling approximately 30 minutes for a moderated Q&A session. I'm going to encourage you to submit your questions through the Zoom chat box during the talk so that I can group them a little bit and also get Dr. Robert Nasi to try and interact with you as we go along. We'll try to fit in as many questions as time allows. And now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a brief on Dr. Robert Nasi. So Robert is the Director General of CIFOR, which is the Center for International Forestry Research, which is located in Bogor, Indonesia. Before we started this conversation, I asked him where he was, and he is located at his home in Indonesia, in Bogor. Robert graduated as a forest engineer from the French National Forestry School and received a PhD in the field of ecology from the University of Paris-Sud-Orsay. Since 1982, he has been living and traveling extensively in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, and has undertaken a vast variety of research activities in the fields of ecology and management of tropical forests. Robert joined CIFOR in August 1999 and has held many research and management positions in the organization, amongst many principal scientist, biodiversity program leader, and program director. His research interests include sustainable use of forest products and multiple use management, integrating social and biological sciences for better management of tropical forests, the wild meat issue, which is the topic today, and implications for biodiversity, livelihoods, and health. The talk today is on wild meat, health, climate, and environment. Why balance matters. This is important. Up to 11 million tons of wild meat are harvested every year across the globe, which poses a big biodiversity threat for hundreds of species. Landscape change and biodiversity losses also then cause major shifts in the ecology of pathogens and their vectors. And this is particularly topical today. Alongside, global warming has triggered many modifications in the density and distribution of wildlife host species and disease reservoirs, therefore expanding the geographic occurrence of infectious diseases. In the talk today, Robert will delve into what these developments mean for human health and discuss a path forward. With this, I'm going to hand over the screen as well as the speaking to Robert. Really a privilege for me to have you here and for my team to have you here, Robert, virtually, if virtually. But thank you so much again, and over to you for now.
Thank you very much, Joe, for the kind introduction. I will try to share my screen. This one. Is it working? Yes.
Yes, it is.
Okay. So we are going to talk today about this whole issue of the nexus between wild meat, health, climate, environment, and why the balance matters in that. And we start about a bit of a digression, I mean, sort of looking at collapse of civilization. And you see that you have people studying that, and if you are familiar with the work of Luke Kemp, it can give you a bit of a nightmare, but fundamentally, the average lifespan of a civilization is about 340 years. And if we put the start of our civilization at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we are not far from the number. So we may wonder, I mean, a sort of, are we on the verge to collapse? And in this study, Luke said that society collapsed because of, and this is previous society, climate change, environment is degraded, natural resources are depleted, inequality increases, the society becomes too complex, it's hit by eternal shock, and then bad luck happens. You get an asteroid on your head, or but if you look at the thing like climate change, and this is a summary on this slide, and you see that we are on the bad trajectory in terms of increasing global warming, increasing greenhouse gas emission. You see the environmental impact here summarized by the consumption of fresh water. You see that the share of the top 1%, I mean, a sort of 26 people in the world have the resource, the equivalent resource of 50% of the population. And you see that our society is getting more and more complex. So a lot of these indicators of society collapse are moving in the wrong direction. Then if you look at the state of forest health and biodiversity, we are in the 6th mass extinction, and it's happening because of us. We are still using large amount of tropical forest every year. This is a State of the Forest 2020. And the forests that are left are more and more fragmented. And that brings us to the issue of the wild meat and the wildlife trade, which is something that people are not necessarily aware, and you don't hear very much in the context of deforestation or degradation or climate change. But to give you an idea, I mean, a sort of, as Joe was saying, I mean, 11 million tons of bushmeat is extracted every year in rainforest area. If you add the savanna, it's much more than that. Comparison, Europe is producing 8 million tons of beef. I mean, so that give you an idea. And as a recommendation, 5 million tons per year in the Congo Basin, it's about 15 million cows or 2 billion chicken, and they are not there. So it's not going to happen. And if you want to put 15 billion cows in the 50 million cows in the Congo Basin, you need to deforest about 10 million hectares, which is not such a hectare. So there is the Bushmeat crisis, where we have an empirical evidence of hunting-related extension, and today a local exploitation for food. And then the question is it really a doomsday? We are not sure, but there is a problem of sustainability and public health. And biodiversity and livelihood of people is affected. And this whole public health issue brings us to the fact that in emerging diseases, 70% of these diseases are zoonoses. They come from animals like SRAS, Marburg, Lassa, Nipah, Ebola. There is also the nutrition where the wild food is rich in essential macronutrients, and the availability of wild meat or fish from diet is linked to anemia and stunting rate in rural population. So, and then, and we are in the middle of it, emerging infectious disease. And if you look at this is a 2016 paper from WHO, the top 8 diseases likely to cause severe epidemics. You have Ebola, Marburg, and then you have MERS, SARS, and they didn't know about COVID-19, but it's also coronavirus like these two. And, and this picture gives you an idea of what is happening every year without people noticing it in terms of the ongoing emerging infectious disease. That was a value, and you see one of the authors is Dr. Fauci in 2004. So nothing new. And that put some people saying that the planet is just becoming an evolutionary and ecological minefield of emerging infectious disease for which millions of people, their crops and their livestock wander daily. And there is more and more empirical evidence that there is a link between deforestation, degradation, and land use change and emerging infectious disease. And these are some snapshots of research paper that show empirical evidence, and the one on scientific report we did with colleagues on Ebola. And it shows that when you remove the spatio-temporal autocorrelation that we see as a link to climate change, 1/4 of the link of Ebola outbreaks is linked to forest loss. And it's much more than any other of the factors. So there is a link between limits of the rainforest domain and deforestation events in the emergence of Ebola outbreaks. And these links is linked to the change in composition, abundance, and behavior of reservoir species that relates in increase in transmission of Ebola. And in the case of Ebola, we are very likely talking about bats, fruit bats. And there is more and more evidence that the human activity changed the way fruit bats are behaving, increase their contact, and increase the chance of this Ebola. But then, and it may be more interesting for the Green Climate Fund, I mean, there is a link between ENSO events and Ebola outbreak. And this is what explains quite a lot of the spatial correlation and spatial temporal correlation we have in Ebola outbreaks. And more generally, there is a link between El Nino southern elevation and health. And here it's a very interesting paper prepared by NOAA, and that gives you in 2014, 2016, they were expecting a very strong El Nino event, and they were saying because of that, we are likely to have more chikungunya, dengue fever, and respiratory illness in Southeast Asia. We are going to have some chikungunya in North America, some malaria in some places. And then you see a few years after, I mean, a sort of what really happened in 2014, 2016. And unfortunately, the predictions were not too bad. I mean, it's sort of this emerging disease outbreak happened and they were linked to El Nino. And now, then your question is how climate change can impact emerging infectious disease? Because fundamentally, you think that this is linked to a virus, host, parasite, pathogen. How this is impacted by climate change? In many ways, in many different ways, and first because of change in temperature and rainfall, you change the vector range. And this is true for a lot of the diseases that have a vector like mosquitoes. And because the climate becomes more humid in some places or warmer, you have the possibility of having mosquitoes that were not living in this place to come, and then you get malaria, chikungunya, Zika, dengue, Japanese encephalitis, Rift Valley fever in places where they will not be before. It is the same for the Lyme disease or for rabies and other, and even the plague. Just as a reminder, I mean, there is plague still happening in the 21st century in North America and in China. Then you also the change in water body temperature or pollution, and then that creates an increase in the waterborne disease like cholera, hepatitis, botulism, and we will see the Boweli ulcer. What climate change also is the host-pathogen population dynamics, and we will see an example later. It's happening in malaria, Ebola, antivirus, Nipah, and so on. And more interestingly, or more frighteningly, climate change because of the storm, because of the climate refugee, because of the heat waves, weaken local population immune system. And the severity of the 2017-2018 flu season was very much linked to the occurrence of extreme events. And people are more and more worried that because of climate change, we are creating a strain of heat-resistant fungi. And one of the reasons why humans are very little attacked by fungi, contrary to plants or amphibians, is because we are endothermic creature. Because our temperature internal is too high for fungi to develop. But now, if you have heat-resistant fungi, it's maybe not the case anymore, and we have first infestation of Candida aureus, heat-resistant. And then, so far as an anecdote, but it could be even more worrying, is what they call zombie contagion. And these are viruses or bacteria or pathogens that have been stored in the frozen permafrost for thousands of years and that are brought back to life because of the thawing of the permafrost. And we have had several episodes of anthrax killing reindeer in the northern taiga, and at the same time creating a risk of people being affected by anthrax. So here is an example of a scientific paper for illustrating the modification of the vector range, and it's about the two mosquitoes, Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus, and you can see that in 2018 there will be a change in the population at risk. Some population, some area will be less affected, but some areas that are not yet affected will be more affected, and unfortunately, these areas that are very highly populated. Another example in host pathogen dynamic is the West Nile virus in America, and here the natural host are birds, and the insect is vector. There is no human-to-human infection. But when you have warmer winter, longer frost-free season, you have an earlier arrival of the bird, and then because of the rising temperature, you have more mosquitoes, so you have more contact with birds and mosquitoes, and people are going out more often, and the result are more impacted, and as a result, a lot of people get sick that would not have been sick if they have been the normal climate. So these are just a few examples. And this has been somewhat summarized in the Stockholm Paradigm, which is a book that has been published in 2019, in July 2019, where in fact people realized that the mix of climate change, environmental degradation, urbanization, and global travel, global trade has dramatically increased the chance for the parasite to jump from his normal host to another one. And this did not happen before because these hosts were not put together, but now people are flying pigs with 747 from a place to other because there is the swine fever, and so they bring, or you are moving wildlife or live market, or you are traveling, or you are living in places that are warmer like cities. So all this creates a much more risk of incidence of emerging disease and of parasite or pathogen jumping from their normal host to another one and at the same time mutating. And all this it's really about connection and imbalance. And on the left part of this slide, you see that from the 1940 to the 2000, I mean, the incidence of emerging infectious disease has increased, and both in number, in terms of the type of infectious disease, in terms of the drug or non-drug resistant, in terms of whether they are zoonotic or not. And on the right, it's a bit of a pictorial explanation between a balanced forest environment, where you have in green the Borrelia ulcer, in red the Nipah virus, in yellow the SIV, HIV/AIDS, and in blue dot the malaria. And then you see that in a balanced environment, I mean, it's sort of these things are not in contact to each other or with humans. But then when you change you deforest and then you move pigs into the place where there was forest, then they become in contact with droppings from the bats, and then they got Nipah, and then after the Nipah jump to human, and then you have several hundred people dead in Malaysia. In terms of the Borrelia ulcer, it's more, it seems that the life of this microorganism is much more, the survival is much more prevalent in area where the water environment has been impoverished, and then we have a high level of nitrate, and so by polluting water, by putting agricultural effluent or human waste in water, you create a place where the Borrelia ulcer can prosper and then reinfect people. Malaria is a bit of a different issue. It's by opening the forest and opening road, you create new area like a small pond or regions where the mosquito larvae find a good living condition, and because of the temperature, and then you increase the incidence of mosquito, and as a result, because people are there also, the contact between mosquito and people and the contamination. And in HIV/AIDS, it's very much linked to Wildmeat, where in fact the first case of HIV/AIDS was in 1905, and then that was traced back, and where someone probably got it from a sick ape. And unfortunately, I mean, if the situation was still like that, the thing would not have moved. But because there was opening of road, because there was transportation, because there was trade, this thing has become the biggest pandemic of our time. So what we need is try to maintain or try to restore our environment. And that's really the main message. And as a sort of some very basic recommendation. I mean, first, we cannot say that we are not aware. The governments were warned several times, and mostly people were caught pants down with this pandemic. We need to have updated and funded pandemic preparedness plans. And some countries had these following the last SARS pandemic. But in fact, because nothing happened for 10 years, they just dropped it. And then problems happen. We need really to create awareness at the national level on the various drivers of emerging infectious disease. And that's where the issue of environmental change, climate change, agricultural practice, human behavior are important. And we need to design proper policies looking at the whole issue of deforestation and degradation. And in some places, I mean, where deforestation or degradation is legal or needed because you need to do agriculture or you need to produce timber, then you need to be very careful and very cautious in terms of the potential risk, and it should be part of the impact assessment in terms of assessing the potential health hazard as part of the EIA, reinforcing primary health service in the affected area, running awareness conference, and blocking any idea of transportation and trade of live animals. And ultimately, I mean, and I think that I'm preaching to the convert here, to be serious about addressing the driver of climate change, as we have seen that climate change is simply aggravating and acting in synergy with all the environmental degradation and our ways of living in terms of increasing the risk of emerging infectious disease. And here there is some list of literature if you want to have a look at it. I mean, it's sort of, and all these papers are available in open access. And I hope that after reading that, you will still be able to sleep at night. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Really, really interesting, exciting, very exciting. We already, and this, this indicates the level of interest. We have we have 50 participants, and we also have a list of questions that are already there on the chat screen. So I'm going to also ask everyone to start writing busily on your chat screens as you have more questions. But I'm going to use the moderator's privilege, Robert, to ask a couple of questions of my own before I throw it open. So the first one is, this sounds all very gloomy, and it's probably a bit controversial, but that's the business we're in. Is there any disease vector that has just disappeared as a consequence of, increasing heat and increased accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere or greenhouse gases, and or have there been things that are positive as a consequence of climate change? So yeah, that's my first question, and I have another one, but go for it.
Locally, first I must say that the literature is probably biased on this issue because people have a tendency to look for problems where there are problems and to overlook the issue where, if everything is fine, nobody talks about it, which is a pity. But you see that, I mean, it's sort of in some area where the climate change is creating a different condition, either because there is more rain or less rain, then you see some hosts disappearing. But I will not bet very much on that. I mean, I think we have, I don't know how many billions of viruses and other pathogens in the world, and it's not because one will be extirpated in one place and a few other thousand emerging in other places that we are in the best situation. So probably a biased answer, but I wouldn't bet on it. But there has been some empirical evidence that it happened in some places.
Yeah, thanks for that, Robert. And my second question before I take questions from our audience is, given the scenarios that you've outlined, what kind of things do you think GCF could do? So, as you know, GCF works on adaptation and mitigation. So adapting to climate change as it's happening, but also trying to stop climate change. But, and I think we can say this safely, our linkages in our programs and our projects with health have been very tenuous, if even there. And so other than public health where indoor air pollution, so that gets touted as one of the most immediate impacts of reduced greenhouse gas emissions, which is reduced indoor air pollution. But I've always thought that, that's much more a consequence of pollution, which is, and less a consequence of greenhouse gas emissions, which are slightly, but importantly different. So it's important, where and how can this linkage be made far more salient? Because in my view, one of the biggest problems of climate change, lack of climate change action, has been people not recognizing that there are immediate benefits of undertaking climate action, which can help to affect a very important good for all of us, which is our own health. But how can an organization like GCF direct its efforts to create that linkage in a far more salient way and to be far more intentional about it?
I think that what you say is true. I mean, but I think it's everybody has been looking very much at the issue of climate change, looking at the issue of whether greenhouse gas emission, or but not really. Or the entry point is okay. You have to capture carbon. If you're talking about forestry, you need to plant trees. But people haven't really made the link between, how can I say, I mean, assess the importance of climate change as an aggravating impact factor in terms of the existing crisis. And that's where sometimes it's difficult, you know, if you go to the, I'm sure if you go to the Green Climate Fund and you tell them, I want to make a project about forest-based nutrition, they will tell you, oh, it's very interesting, but it's not us, because there's no impact with climate change. And in fact, the fact is that, yeah, maybe not, but climate change has a strong impact on that, and as a result, there is the feedback loop. And so I think that I would say that for an organization like the GCF, like for many organizations, what they should do is really embrace a One Health approach, where in fact it's looking at the whole issue holistically and looking both at climate change in terms of the risk that we see in greenhouse gases accumulation, but also in terms of climate change as an effect, pretty efficient killer or aggravating situation for a lot of the situation we have. That's the thing I would say, and then that means that probably adaptation should have an even bigger role than it has now compared to mitigation, and that we can probably prove, if we are clever enough, that there are immediate gains to get in fighting climate change, and we don't need to wait 50 years from now in terms of seeing the benefits of our action. And of course, if you link COVID with climate change, then you see that the cost of inaction is just thwarting the cost of doing something.
Absolutely. Thank you, Robert. So I'm going to go to some of the questions. Well, actually, the first one comes from our colleague at the IEU, Dr. Archie Rastogi, who links it also and speaks about a little bit of this because he talks about risk. And I think that's what you're talking about as well, that there is an increase in risk in our overall ecosystem, right? With this accumulation and with the linkage if we fail to address it. But his question is, can you illustrate, and it goes back to one of the first few slides that you presented, how complexity as well as increased risk of collapse. So that's the first question, but also then related to the question that you just asked, we have another colleague from the Integrity Unit, Sanjeev Narayan, who is asking how far do adaptation and mitigation projects, how can they be effective in reversing the trends of contracting infectious diseases? I'm going to put these out to you as I try and collect a few others. So one is risk of collapse. And then the other one is climate mitigation and adaptation and reversing trends.
The risk of collapse is it's something that I was totally oblivious about this not long ago, and then it becomes to me, unfortunately, more and more something that may happen. Look at the situation. The COVID-19, it's a human disaster, but fundamentally not a very strong or lethal disease. I mean, so fatality rate is 1-2%. People are not sure, but it's not huge. I mean, it's sort of think about the same thing happening, and you have seen the situation where we are because of the way our society is organized. I mean, it's sort of value chain are stopped. You cannot trade. People are dying on hunger in one place, other people are crushing 100,000 of tons of potato in another one. The financial sector could collapse. So think about the equivalent of COVID-19 with MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome disease, which is also coronavirus. MERS has a fatality rate of 30 to 60%. So that means that 3 to 6 people out of 10 that get MERS die. So think about something like that becoming a pandemic like the COVID-19, and then I'm pretty sure that you are facing collapse of the civilization. Like there was a collapse of the civilization during the Black Plague in Europe, or the Justinian Plague in the Roman Empire, or borderline with the Spanish flu in 1918. These things are equivalent to World War. I mean, sort of the mortality rate. It's something that is impensable. So, and unfortunately, it becomes possible. Fortunately, if you are prepared, that can be managed. But that means that we are serious in being prepared. And that's where I don't think that we can really revert the situation. I think that we need to do is be prepared for the next one and be seriously prepared, because you see that the country that were better prepared, they fare much better. Take the case of Korea. People remember very well the SARS, and there has been a long history of people wearing masks in public place, and I'm pretty sure that it has had an impact in terms of the initial spread. Or Germany, where compare my two countries, Germany and France, I mean, a sort of same number of same infection rate, and something like 5 times more deaths in France and in Germany, because there were more ICU in Germany. So, but that requires investment. And that's the thing that is difficult, because for whatever reason, the human nature has a tendency to react when there is a problem, but it's very difficult when people, they have to pay in advance or something that they don't see. And that's what the climate change community is facing. Climate change is going to impact you in 50 years from now. So,
and Robert, I'm combining a few questions from Andreas as well as from Eben and Habiba. First is, do you have another disease vector or disease that you are worried about that might be emerging? But also, as the world thinks about being ready the next time, and we have been warned now, as you rightly said, what do you think would be the components of a pandemic preparedness plan? What should we be thinking about as we go forward? And how can we break this overall cycle of pathogen-related climate change? Any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, first I have to put a caveat. I'm not a medical doctor and so I'm a specialist of health, but if you just speak in terms of common sense, and I will go back to the potential risk. What you need is you need to have a strong public health system, and that means that people have to invest in their public health system, and maybe many countries could invest a bit less in spending money for military expenditure and a bit more on health system, because without the public health system, then you are facing with not enough emerging unit beds, and then you are very quickly overwhelmed when the crisis happens. Then you need to have people aware that these things can happen. I mean, ignorance is bliss, but it's not bliss. So that's the thing. It's mainly in terms of thinking that this is going to rehappen one way or the other. What have we learned from the current crisis? I mean, sort of, do we really need to have food moving 10,000 kilometers from one place to the other to be processed to go back to the initial place? I mean, it's sort of it, because when you can't travel, the food is not moving. Do we need to look at much more localized approach in terms of food security and nutrition. Similarly, is it very reasonable to let 2 countries in the world having the capacity to produce 95% of the basic medicine? I mean, a sort of, even to produce something as basic as the paracetamol, 90% of the capacity is in India and China. And that's the sort of the common sense where you don't put all your egg in one basket. That's very much. Yeah. And in terms of the one that is potentially frightening, I think that we have to be scared of the potential of the whole virus linked to a flu type virus, because we haven't had so far a very lethal flu type virus that at the same time can move from human to human. One of the most lethal ones, the bird flu, in fact, moves from bird to human, but there is no real contamination human to human. If we have a bird flu type contamination human to human, or something like an airborne Ebola, then it's going to be very bad. Very, very bad.
Yeah,
and it can happen. That's the problem.
Yeah,
and you don't know.
So, Robert, you're the DG of an international research organization, and you know, we are sitting at the GCF, only the largest climate fund in the world. Where do you think? And we have all witnessed, you know, the controversy that has surrounded multilateralism, with WHO being decried and insulted as, oh well, it failed in some quarters, and then others talking about how it was one of the first few agencies to call the global pandemic. I think I'm interested in hearing your thoughts about what can global organizations such as ours, yours and mine, do in terms of both setting standards, providing guidance, but also thinking of a new way of living. And it also relates to a couple of questions that came on the chat, screen. So Edward Shin talks about, you know, our obsession with GDP. And do you think that we should be thinking of a new measure that could be a KPI that could drive different behavior? And Yanji, who's a colleague, also talks about how, are there behavior changes that we could help to take forward? So both your hat as a DG of an international organization, you know, what are the things that international organizations can be doing? And second, what are the things that we could be doing both as heads of organizations, but also on the ground to bring about behavior change that is clearly required?
I think the problem that international organizations are facing, and the CIFOR being a very small one, it's the whole issue of whether they can maintain their independence or not. I mean, and I think that one of the problems with the WHO is that it becomes very difficult for them to maintain their independence when they rely on a handful of donors, and when the donor tell them, oh, we are going to put you funding. I mean, so that's something that we have all to realize. I mean, international organizations should not be created to please the parties. They should be created for problem or make sure that the problem do not happen. And for that, they need to be independent, and they must be allowed to say things that are not necessarily pleasant to hear, not necessarily palatable. Political correctness is going to kill us all. And I think that's the main problem that we have with the organization that are parties, because you cannot publish something because one of the parties is opposed to that. I mean, so I think that's something that should be part of our collective action if we want to do. And then everybody at his level, I mean, it's sort of that for a forestry organization like CIFOR is looking at issues that we will not have looked traditionally, and going beyond silviculture or plantation. Okay, what's the link between forest cover and nutrition and health, or what's the link between biodiversity, forest, and pest pathogens. So they're really thinking of all this approach that is summarized under the One Health term that we could all look at and having a vision that is a bit less sectoral than. I think that will be for climate, Green Climate Fund to see, oh, we are willing to fund a project and that doesn't look immediately climate related, but in fact has a very strong link to that and can help us in terms of solving the issue.
Yeah, absolutely right. Thanks, Robert. So then I have questions from both Greg and Paul, who are asking, okay, you know, wild meat consumption is clearly one of the causes of some of the things that you spoke about. But in many countries, it's also a very important part of our overall culture and our identities and customs and traditions. Is there any way that we could think of making wild meat consumption sustainable and or be appropriate and sensitive about cultural identities and customs? Yeah.
Yeah, I think first, I mean, it's sort of a word of caution. I mean, it's sort of, we have been talking about wild meat because this is something that I've been working with, but there are as much or as many emerging diseases that come from domestic animals more than from wild animals. Bird flu, swine flu, they all come from domestic. The whole issue of animal-based food is risky, and it's risky for domestic or wild animals. What is happening is that for most of the domestic animals, you have veterinary system, you have very stringent standard and something like that. But in fact, the wild meat part of the market is something dark at the bottom of the market where there is no water, and you step on blood. And so I think that it can be organized so that it has a better safety and health standard, and it's better recognized in terms of driven into criminality. Will it be sustainable? Probably not if it continues like that, because population increase but it can be sustainable in places like rural the Congo Basin or something, because the harvest is, and depending on the species that you harvest, is relatively sustainable. But what you need is you need to implement the same safety, the same health protocol that you do for your domestic meat if you want to make it safe. But again, I mean, it's sort of the whole issue of the trade of live animal is one of the big risks. And it's for food, but it's also for pets. And very few people are really trained for that. I mean, it's sort of, the immigration officer, they check that the species is in the list of protected species. You don't check if the species is the host of a very bad virus that is going to contaminate the rest of the population. I think that there is only one species, one thing that is checked is the yeast of psittacosis for the parrot and that. So that is something that we could do. I mean, it's sort of how you can make sure that you don't check only if the species is on the site health list, but also if it's a risk for the public health. So what they do very stringently in countries like Australia, because they have had some very bad experience, but not everywhere.
Thanks, Robert. I should add that the previous question, there was also interest in that previous question by one additional audience member, Jarinella Chesney. So thank you so much for that question. Andreas asks, how can we make the topic, and this is related to something that Yonji asked as well, topic and the links between forest habitat health and communities to become more attractive to donors? And is there something that you can use from your experience and insights from CIFOR and your success in putting forests on the map that you could share with us in this context?
It's very much linked to the extent you can make your research, your result known to the media, and we are getting better at that in CIFOR. We have invested in communication heavily, and it has an impact. But it to a certain extent, so that's where it becomes after important if you can get some very strong advocate or. And I'm always joking. I say, okay, I have 4,000 followers on Twitter. I mean, it's sort of if I was like Rihanna with 90 million, and if I send something on Twitter, I mean, that will have a much bigger impact. And it's half a joke, in fact, and it's the whole issue. But it's a double-edged sword also. So science research should keep the rigor and based on empirical evidence, but we should very much rely on the media in terms of passing the message, a clear message to people and telling the risk so that people realize. And I don't know, I mean, sort of.
Anything, Robert, that you can use from your experience of putting forests on the map and been really successful, actually, that would help?
I'm not sure. Well, I'm not sure that we have been very successful. You know, we are still a sort of a small forest organization in a bigger agricultural world. So I think the most important is probably to look beyond the box, to speak. A lot of the problem that foresters have been experiencing in the past is because they were thinking that forestry is much too serious a business to discuss that with non-forester people. And that was a big mistake. I mean, so you really have to look at opening and discussing across sectors and looking at, instead of starting the issue by a sectoral angle, starting the issue, okay, we have a problem, and this problem is a problem that is a forestry problem, but it's also an agricultural problem, it's also a urbanization problem, and we need to tackle this problem together. And it's difficult because everybody has its own agenda, vested interest, you are competing for the same pot of money. So, but it's only by doing that all the time and repeating that you end up eventually having an impact. And repeating when things are not happening. Because now everybody is on fire with COVID-19, but who remembered the 1968 flu pandemics that killed 1 million people?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think we are literally at that point in time, a huge challenge for our generation, but also the previous one and the next one, where we have to rethink. And as you and I were talking before this webinar started, Robert, one of the things that I think is definitely emerging is that although people are talking about pushing the reset button, what we are not witnessing is a big change in the way people are doing things, other than, yes, Twitter putting it out there that they are happy to have people work from home, you know, till the end of time. But really, we're not seeing that huge mass upheaval of change that one would expect for something as dramatic as what we are witnessing and going through ourselves. And that also refers to an inelasticity of behavior, right? Human beings tend to cling to things that are familiar to them rather than change because these are unexamined and they're so disruptive to our own lives and have not been tested by our generations before. It also sort of makes me think a lot more about behavior change. And in climate action, we've seen climate action has just been inadequate or so nascent, even though the science has been so strong in this space. And it's been primarily because we haven't been able to convince the actors on the ground. And you have the problem of a large good which requires simultaneous coordinated action by every individual who can only contribute in a minuscule way. But if everyone contributed together, you could make a change. But that is really, and the absence of that sort of simultaneous, coordinated, agreed upon action has essentially meant that we are not seeing the needle change on climate action. And my concern really every day is to what extent are we going to see this in this, big issue of public health, where clearly everyone's responsibility is going to affect everyone else. Behavioral science. So this is a topic that we are examining also within the independent evaluation unit, where organizations and multilateral institutions can keep focusing on putting research out there, but also money out there. But unless they concentrate on changing that last mile, the behavior of the last mile, and really covering that gap, we're not going to see a lot of action on the ground. And climate action has shown that, and I think we are seeing that with somewhat public health as well, although I do think that we are being far more successful here. One thing that we've started to look at, because as a consequence of the disruption far more, is then behavioral science. And this is work that you know of and we spoke about when we last met in Bonn, and to try and see as to how we can think about better choices being made by human beings that are far more responsible and in tune with what they expect to do, but they are just aren't doing. And this is one area that we would like to explore more, and we are hoping very much that we'll be able to collaborate with many actors, including yourselves and a lot of the wonderful colleagues that also work at CIFOR. But with that, I did want to then leave you with the last word on this, Robert, if you wanted to come in for anything else before we close.
I mean, it's know that this whole issue of behavioral change is a very, very interesting one, and it's something that we are trying in a large project that we have with FAO, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and CIRAD on sustainable wildlife management. It's really in places where people have no obligation to eat wild meat for their dietary needs. I mean, it's sort of like in large urban centers. How do you change the behavior of the people? Or how would you change the behavior to the people in China so that they stop buying rhinoceros horns medicine? That's very important. But there is something that is underlying this, and that we have a tendency to forget, is that many people do not have the option of changing behavior. I mean, 3 billion people are unable to follow the so-called perfect diet proposed by the Lancet. 3 billion. So the question is the same. I mean, so it's very easy to tell people, you should eat healthy food, and you should stop having too much of the sugary drink, something like that, but the only thing they have, the only thing they can afford. And that relates to the whole issue of the growing inequality and inequity in our society. I'm sorry, but who needs billionaire in the 21st century? That's the point. I mean, it's sort of, we have created a system where, in fact, even if people want to change their behavior, I mean, they have no alternative option. And maybe this is where international organization or research organization can make a change. Can we provide affordable alternative option for people to change their behavior? The question is open.
Absolutely. And with that provocation, Robert, I'm going to thank you for a fantastic hour that you led, and for spending that hour with us. I really, really appreciate it. I know that we're going to get a lot of questions and comments on your talk, and we're looking forward to staying engaged with yourself and with CIFOR and all of your wonderful colleagues there. We'd like to continue, CIFOR and the IEU have a long-standing collaboration now, and we'll continue to do and work towards this, strengthening this collaboration as we go forward. And with that, I wish you that you stay negative. And I wish you a safe and healthy stay in Bogor. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye.
Safe, stay negative. Bye for now.